This is TLV1.
The Tel Aviv Review.
Hello and welcome to the Tel Aviv Review, a program dedicated to books and research about a broad range of issues pertaining to Israel and beyond. This interview was made possible by the Z3 Project, an initiative of the Oshman family JCC, committed to creating an ongoing dynamic forum for opinions and ideas about diaspora Jewry in Israel. The Oshman family JCC is a premier source in the Silicon Valley of exciting and innovative programming focused on architecting the Jewish future. For more information about Z3, visit z3project.org. My guest today is one of the leading newspaper columnists in the United States, currently with the New York Times. Prior to that, he held several senior editorial positions, most notably with the Wall Street Journal and the Jerusalem Post, and won a Pulitzer Prize in 2013. Bret Stephens, hello and welcome to the show.
It's nice to be with you.
So you are a well-known critic of President Trump, as you have been since the beginning of his foray into politics. Now, if you look at the state of American politics now, in late 2019, 3 years into his presidency, is it better, worse, or pretty much what you expected in 2016?
I think it's pretty much what I expected. I mean, my view of a Trump presidency was not that it would be a source of catastrophes, but that it would be a cause of corrosion of institutions, corrosion of norms, corrosion of manners. And I think all of that has been really borne out by his behavior and his tenure of office. The best example, of course, is the way in which we have gone about operating, we, the United States, operating in Syria vis-a-vis our presumptive allies, the Kurds, now betrayed, and our presumptive foes, the Assad regime, the Iranians, the Russians, and to a certain extent, the Turks. They're now emboldened. And anyone who was attentive to what Trump was saying when he started his run for president shouldn't be surprised, because Trump, for all of his superficial differences with President Obama, shared certain core convictions. I mean, I think of Trump as basically a truculent isolationist or quasi-isolationist. And there was an aspect of the Obama presidency that you might describe as a kind of a moralistic isolationism. The results have been similar. And so while I have applauded things that this administration has done, particularly moving the embassy to Jerusalem and withdrawing from the JCPOA, I think what we're witnessing now in the Middle East from this administration is not altogether surprising.
Do you think it will have a long-term impact on the way things are run in the world, in America's sphere of influence, after Trump steps down, whether it's next year or in 5 years' time?
Look, I mean, since we're here in the heart of Silicon Valley, there's always a 2.0 and a 3.0. And I think it's worth asking ourselves just what Trump 2.0 look like, because there will be some next stage, some next iteration. And my fear is that Trump 2 and 3 and 4.0 will contain some of the destructive elements, but might be packaged or presented in clever and more insidious forms. I mean, right now, Trump's persona, the kind of coarseness of it, in some ways is a kind of a saving grace, because it's easier to notice what he's doing. But at some point, we will get a very clever version of Trump who might look like someone like Viktor Orban in Hungary, or even an Erdogan in Turkey. And at that point, we might not know what hit us. The United States is a liberal democracy, which is to say that we have, broadly speaking, liberal values when it comes to free speech, pluralism, and so on, and democratic processes. But it's possible to imagine a future, not just for American liberal democracy, but democracies elsewhere, which will be illiberal, in which democratically elected leaders do not support core liberal principles. And I'm not speaking ideologically, I'm speaking about liberalism in a very classic sense, about respect for individual freedom. And that's what concerns me about this administration.
But a liberal democratic system is normally fostered by a liberal culture that we see in America. And I don't think it's new. Tell me if you think it's a radical change from what we've seen before in terms of, popular and perhaps populist politics. Where do you think, America, the United States, with the great tradition of centuries of liberal democracy, where do you think all this stems from?
Look, there have always been illiberal currents in American politics. And one of the miracles of the United States is that those illiberal currents have consistently been have been defeated by more liberal currents. The South and the antebellum South, with its slave, quote unquote, democracy, was an illiberal movement. It was destroyed. Jim Crow was illiberal. That too was destroyed. That has been a happy story of nearly 250 years of American history. But those currents have always been present, and they've been present on both sides of the ideological divide. Today I look at a right, the political right, which is increasingly illiberal when it comes to the concepts about an open society, an immigration-based society. I'm the child of a refugee to this country, and I look at strains of illiberalism on the left that disturb me, especially when it comes to the censoring of free speech or the suppression of free speech on college campuses. And I think these two streams are moving together, and as much as they might claim to detest each other, they have more in common than either side would care to admit.
You said that the fact that these populist trends were outperformed by responsible leaders is a miracle. Do you attribute it to chance? And if so, what can be done to rectify that? Because if it's just chance, there's really nothing we can do but hope.
Maybe miracle is too strong a word, but in the broad arc of history, it is almost miraculous, because to choose the tenets of a free society, to tolerate people whose core beliefs vary fundamentally from our own, to accept that people whose views we fear and detest nonetheless have a legitimate right to air those views. These are not things that come naturally to human beings. I think naturally we tend to seek a certain kind of conformism, but they are an inheritance that comes down to us almost directly from the Mayflower Compact and the traditions of first religious heterodoxy or religious dissent, and then intellectual dissent that have been part of the American story for, now really almost exactly 400 years. But we are at risk of losing them in part because we no longer teach that history. We no longer make that history central to our own identity. The state of civic education in the United States is absolutely atrocious.
Is it worse than it was before?
I suspect it is. Because civic education in civics, I think there are metrics, and I don't have them at my fingertips, has really just collapsed. And it used to be the case that, at least at the university level, a lot of students would get what amounted to a remedial education in, American history, in the Constitution. Universities are no longer performing that function. So we have a president of the United States today who does not know how many articles there are in the Constitution of the United States. And I hate to think if he knows how many amendments we have, much less what they say. So if that is the state of knowledge on the part of the president, you can imagine what it looks like further downstream. And every now and then you come across these shocking statistics about how many Americans have no idea who the vice president is or who the chief justice is. And nobody should be surprised with that level of ignorance should breed a kind of a quality of misunderstanding and antipathy towards the moral foundations of a liberal republic.
Why do you think there are so few people in your political camp?
What is my political camp?
The more conservative.
I guess.
It's fair to say that, isn't it? Yeah.
On some issues.
On some issues. Yeah. Why there are so few people who don't speak out as vocally as you do against those currents of corruption?
Well, I'm not sure I'm such a lonely voice. The so-called camp of never-Trumpers may be relatively small politically, but in the kind of realm of public intellectuals, it's a pretty broad field. So I'm hardly alone in making this case. But I do think that people view politics as a question of simply taking sides. And there is a certain innate tribalism in any society, including so-called modern or advanced societies. And that tribalism is on display in not just sort of ethnic categories, but political ones as well. And if people feel that they're getting what they want out of politics on a personal level, for instance, if the economy is doing well, as it is doing reasonably well, then it's difficult to sort of stand up and say, no thanks, this is not the kind of politics that I want as a template for my children's future. So I think that must have something to do with it.
And what about really the role of established politics, the big parties, people who are in those circles and are also Trump is just one person, but it's like the culture around it that is problematic here, isn't it? I mean, had he not been enabled by Republican senators and Congress people, it would have been different, wouldn't it?
Well, I mean, he's enabled because at least, a significant percentage of the Republican Party is basically sympathetic to the president. The president has shown that he is not remotely averse to supporting primary challenges against members of his own party if those members appear to be disloyal. That's what keeps them in line. The business of a politician ultimately is to get reelected. It's not to advance, or it's rarely to advance a set of principles or policies. And when you think of the Republicans who have that quaint concept of what politics is about, you think of Jeff Flake, Bob Corker, perhaps, the late John McCain. These are people who are no longer in politics. That there's a reason for that. And so the Republican Party yields to Trump for the same reason that parties always yield to the leader, because he has the ability to destroy their chosen profession. I just don't understand why anyone would want to stay in politics and so compromise themselves that they would be hard-pressed to give an account of their honest account of their actions in the great upstairs.
Do you think it's changing? There's moments of reckoning within those people?
I don't see it quite yet, and I don't see it for one main reason, which is that the state of the economy is fairly good. Don't forget that Nixon was on the road to not only impeachment, but almost certainly removal from office, above all because after the 1973 Yom Kippur War, the Arab oil embargo, the United States experienced a very sharp recession, price spikes in oil and so on. And so there was a kind of a boiling mood in the country that was loosely connected to Nixon, but things may have been different if the Watergate scandal had taken place when unemployment was very low and growth was reasonably good.
That's a terrible indictment of American political culture.
I think it's a statement of fact about any political culture. I'm not sure that this would be untrue almost in any other political system.
Let's turn to American-Israeli relations. Mm-hmm. What do you think on the balance is Trump's track record so far on that?
It's too soon to tell. Trump, on the one hand, has pursued specific policies that have been remarkably sympathetic and I think welcome with respect to Israel. I mentioned a few of them earlier, the embassy move, Golan Heights, JCPOA decision. On the other hand, Trump is fundamentally out of step with the concept of the liberal international order, which was really put into place, at least in the United States, by Harry Truman just a year before Israel came into being. And I think a little bit of history is important here. After World War II, the United States made a decision to be, in effect, the guarantor of this liberal international order of the free world against its despotic enemies. And so think about the period 1948 to 1950. Truman recognizes the state of Israel. He orders the airlift for West Berlin when it was blockaded by Stalin, and then a couple of years later he comes to the defense of South Korea on the view that the United States would better secure the peace of the world by coming to the defense of free people facing danger at the farthest edges of the free world. Greece and Turkey also fit into that picture. And so that was an idea that in some ways led us to certain misadventures like Vietnam, and you might even make the argument in the case of Iraq and the end of the Saddam Hussein regime. On the other hand, broadly speaking, it kept the world tilting towards freedom under the umbrella of American power and with the prospect of an American peace that I think was good for the world. The America First policy that Trump espouses, by contrast, harks back to a previous era. America First literally emerges as the isolationist movement before World War II, in which people look at America as a transactional actor with a set of interests, pursuing those interests irrespective to the values and motivations of other countries around the world. I don't think Israel would necessarily thrive and prosper as it has if a succession of future presidents are more in line with the America First worldview than with that liberal international order I described. In fact, I think Israel would find itself very much alone. Just imagine if Trump or a future president didn't have a kind of a carve-out, make an exception for the U.S. alliance with Israel, even as the U.S. distanced itself from other powers in the region. I think Israel would be very lonely.
But it's not just the America First isolationists. It's also what you call the moral isolationists,
Yes.
Obama. So is really the outlook of American governments on both sides of the aisle towards the way global affairs, the way the world is run, is just radically changing following the discrediting of that post-war order.
I don't think that post-war
Vietnam
order
and later in Iraq
was discredited, quite frankly. I think in any global order there will be misadventures and mishaps, but at the end of the day, even Iraq, as traumatic as it was by the standards of the wars of the 20th century, pretty much a footnote. I mean, think about 4,000 Americans or so died in Iraq. Those are tragedies, obviously. And no one should try to trivialize the extent of the sacrifice, but it is a matter of fact that compared to any given day on the Western Front in World War I or most days in the Pacific in World War II, it was not a major war in American history. And the same is true with Afghanistan. So you might make a perfectly sound argument that those wars proved to be unwise in a sense from a tactical point of view, but I don't think it discredits the overall idea that the United States should safeguard what we call the free world because we have the will and the wherewithal to do so. And, of course, you're absolutely right. The left, in many ways, has been equally guilty. I wrote an entire book on this that was published during the Obama administration called America in Retreat. My principal indictment at that time was of the left because Obama was in office. But that book does contain a chapter called Republicans in Retreat, warning that these isolationist tendencies that were sweeping the Democratic Party could sweep the Republican Party as well. And the worst outcome from an Israeli point of view is if you have a bipartisan consensus in the United States that does not think that America ought to have a role in providing security guarantees to embattled, if imperfect, democratic allies like South Korea or Israel or Estonia or what have you.
But irrespective of the normative dimension here, whether America should be a global leader, do you think that this impulse still persists in the political system in this country in both parties?
Well, in fact, from a historical point of view, it is the default view of America. Look, I mean, the United States had this extraordinary advantage over the European states of the 18th and 19th centuries, that we had these two enormous oceans as our moats, so to speak, that provided us a margin of safety, not a total margin of safety. We fought a very nasty war with Britain in 1812, nearly got into war with other European powers along the way. But nonetheless, it created the sense that America could voluntarily withdraw from the travails and tribulations of Europe and the rest of the world. That may have had a basis, in fact, when crossing the Atlantic was a 2-week or 3-week, journey powered by wind. It has no basis, in fact, when an intercontinental ballistic missile can go from a missile site in Russia to Washington, D.C. in 30 minutes. I mean, look, the United States, I can understand why Americans would like to sometimes imagine that we could be just like, say, New Zealand. a pleasant little country at the edge of the world that is no bother to anybody, right? But we're not, and we never will be. So we have a destiny that is going to bring us into contact and sometimes into conflict with all sorts of foreign powers, some of them quite hostile. And we have to have something approaching a serious foreign policy and an intellectual framework that can sustain us in the long term. We learned before World War I that the balance of power concept is not a reliable guarantor of security. And we learned before World War II that the collective security concept is also not a reliable guarantor of security. What does turn out to work is what, sometimes is called Pax Americana, that a big liberal democratic power with tremendous economic wherewithal and significant military might is prepared to stare down the North Koreas, Irans, Russias, and Chinas of the world. And I think the future of the 21st century depends on our willingness to preserve or persevere in that role.
Were you surprised by how few fellow Americans hold that view? How many think that America should be a New Zealand of sorts, reflected in Trump's ascent and then election?
I'm not sure what Americans really think about foreign policy. I don't think most Americans devote a lot of time to thinking things
That's part of the problem, isn't it?
through. Well, it's a big country, and not everyone here, people have things to do with their lives that don't necessarily include theorizing, or pondering theories of state. Look, in Israel, the geographic margins are so narrow. The enemy is literally within eyeshot if you're on the northern border or if you're in Sderot. So Israelis don't have the luxury of imagining that their adversaries are far, because their adversaries are indeed kilometers or meters away in some cases. We Americans do have that luxury, but that luxury is a compromised or a challenging one, because it also creates the danger of illusion. It creates the danger of illusion that because our enemies are geographically thousands of miles away, that we might not find ourselves being forced to confront them in ways we rarely expect. 9/11 was a moment when we suddenly realized just how thin the skin was of that illusion. That event is now nearly or more than 18 years in the past, frankly, an entire generation. And we run the risk of forgetting that. And a lot of the job of foreign policy people who think about this subject, is to be in contact with realities that I think much of the American public is either too busy to see or would prefer just not to think about.
But there's an inherent disconnect here between the tendencies of the people who, as you say, are not really interested in foreign policy, and the role of the leadership to have a very, orderly foreign policy approach. Because when people vote, they vote according to their own will and their own worldview. That is, that kind of disinterestedness should be reflected, as democratic vote, should be reflected in the representatives that they send to Washington. But then, these representatives in Washington, as you say, should have a more activist, should have a more clear-eyed view of foreign policy. How do you think that should be reconciled?
Well, it's a very important question that you're asking, and it really comes down, to put it in a blunt way, to the question of the quality of our cliches. Ultimately, pedagogy about complex foreign policy questions will have to be boiled down to one-liners. And you can get one-liners that are wise and one-liners that are dangerous. When Barack Obama came to office talking about nation building at home and turning the chapter on a decade of war, I thought those were dangerous one-liners because, unfortunately, as Leon Trotsky is reputed to have said, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. So the idea that you could just turn the page on that chapter is an illusion. The idea that nation building at home is somehow incompatible with a certain kind of nation building abroad is also an illusion. So the cliches that should matter to us is, America is the indispensable country. History has taught us that when we turn our back on the world doesn't turn its back on us. The world is filled with dangerous actors who mean us harm. America has a role in standing up for the freedom of people everywhere, and by doing so, we safeguard our own freedoms. I mean, I'm just making this stuff up off the top of my head, but those are the kinds of baseline thoughts that actually communicate a certain kind of worldview in a way that is potentially persuasive and emotionally affecting and inspiring. And Americans have, in fact, historically risen to some of these challenges because America does have a profoundly idealistic self-conception. I don't think we think of ourselves on either side of the aisle as just any other country. We see ourselves as a country with a mission founded on a set of ideas that are universal. And that is, say, distinct from, I don't know, Switzerland, right? I mean, I don't know what the Swiss mission in the world is other than quality chocolates and private banking. And God bless Switzerland. It's a nice thing for a country to be. But we have always, from our founding, had a sense of ourselves as having a large purpose that goes beyond our border. And I think it is possible to inspire Americans to the right set of ideas, provided you have leaders who know how to communicate these ideas in ways that are simple but not simplistic and that are true.
Do you see any forces within national politics that you can rely on to be the standard bearers of that?
Right now, I find the political picture in the United States very depressing. I recently wrote a column enthusiastically endorsing the idea of a Mike Bloomberg candidacy. I'm referring to the former New York City mayor, not because he's Jewish, although that is in my view a kind of a nice point in his favor, but because I think Bloomberg has a sober-minded, traditional concept of America's place in the world, going back to being, a pre-baby boomer who kind of grew up in a certain era when American power really counted, and it still does, but counted for something in people's minds. But I look at people like Elizabeth Warren, Bernie Sanders, and Donald Trump, and, I feel like knocking my head against a wall.
Did it make you reevaluate Obama's presidency?
Well, Obama's presidency was a success from the point of view of symbolism. I think it was much less successful from the point of view of substance or policy. But look, there was never a moment when I looked at Obama as president and said, I'm so ashamed that he's the president. I disagreed with him, broadly speaking, on all kinds of issues. But at some level, I felt proud of the fact that he was president. And yes, it had something to do with being our first African-American president. He represented kind of a fantastic overcoming, it seemed, of centuries of prejudice. I thought he and his family maintained a sense of, understood the dignity of the office. They were role models. By the way, I think that stuff is immensely important. They represented the office of head of state, as distinct from head of government, I think very capably. And I do sometimes miss it in the sense that I find Trump's demeanor shameful, shocking, embarrassing, humiliating to my children, you name it. But Trump is setting examples that at some point we are going to regret.
Right. Bret Stephens, a columnist for the New York Times. Thank you very much for appearing on the show.
Thank you for hosting me.
And also many thanks to Gizem Ozdemir, our sound engineer, Itai Shalem, our producer, as well as Amitai Freeman, the director of the Z3 project. Now we've got a request. Many or most of you listen to us on the Apple Podcasts app, and we would like to ask you to please consider writing us a review. Just launch the app, select our podcast in the library section, scroll down to ratings and review, and then press write a review, and of course, write one. You can also support us by going to our website, that's tlv1.fm/Tel Aviv Review, and subscribing to our Patreon campaign. Every little helps. Check out our archive with more than 500 interviews, and if you like what we do here, you can also like us on Facebook. Our page is called the Tel Aviv Review Podcast, Ideas from Israel. Join us next week for another edition of the Tel Aviv Review, and until then, goodbye.